Hi guys, it's Tristan in Japan right now, Funabashi City, Chiba Prefecture, Japan. Got my whiskey and tonic, I think, and I think I'd like to just introduce some Japanese topics for not only American people but English-speaking people outside of Japan, and perhaps English-speaking people in Japan as well. I think it's interesting. I think tonight I think I'll talk about business in Japan, and my wife and I run a small business. It's an English school, and there aren't a lot of opportunities for foreigners, non-Japanese people who speak, who don't speak Japanese fluently from the beginning anyway, to work in Japan. So you kind of have to work in English is basically the idea. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about what the process is like of working in the field of English in Japan, and I don't want to do it in a business capacity, so I'm going to post this on my own channel, on me and my channel. It's a difficult process if you want to start your own school. I think most people probably wouldn't do this because it's just so strenuous on the mind and on the body, but we decided to do it. We came out of the Marshall Islands in 2014 to Japan, and we decided to start the school, and it's really a difficult process. The actual creation of a business isn't actually that difficult in Japan. It's a pretty easy process. As long as you speak Japanese, can read, write Japanese, and are Japanese, at least for Ami, it was a pretty easy process. I suggested to her that we start a business, and she followed through and went to the Chamber of Commerce, which I'm sure is the way in most countries that allow for the establishment of business, private business, and in that way our business was created. The challenges are not so much in the establishment of the business, but in the actual making of money. So I thought I might introduce that idea of how it is to actually create income from a business here in Japan. If your ideas are corroborate with the mentality of the Japanese people, in other words, if your way of doing business is in line with the Japanese way, then I think that it's pretty much a guarantee that you'll make money. In our case, our philosophy doesn't actually fall in line with the Japanese way. Our business model is very much independent of the Japanese way of thinking. In other words, the way we teach English is very much international, and in Japan that's not the way of things. So if you have a different business model and you try to start a company in Japan, I think you're going to have real problems doing that. In our case, we're devoted, and we're making that cause to move forward along those lines of what we promote. But if you're not selling something, either a service or a product, that doesn't fall in line with the way that Japanese people want it done or made, then you're probably not going to succeed. So I thought, maybe if you're a foreigner and even if you have a Japanese spouse, whether a wife or a husband, how might you go about establishing a company? And if you have a good idea and a good premise, then Japan is the kind of place where the people will agree with you to begin with. I think you'll have a good sense to begin with if it'll work or not. In our case, we didn't really care, I guess you could say. It's not very good business practice, obviously, to go into an industry in which you are aware that people won't immediately accept what you're doing. But in our case, we did that knowing that people wouldn't readily accept what we're doing. So if you're thinking about coming here and establishing a business, it's easy enough to make one. If you can get your spouse, assuming that they're Japanese, if you can get them to agree with you, then probably you'll succeed if your business is, applicable to Japan. But in the case of English and the English business here, I don't think there's a lot you can do that will change the system here, because what we're trying to do in our business too is to change that basic way of thinking about English and internationalism and all that. We don't just teach English, we also do parenting advice and all that. So it's a real challenge, I think, when you start to combine language with culture and globalism and all that kind of thinking. I think people really struggle with it. So funny thing is, like, I wouldn't really recommend Japan to people. I lived in the Marshall Islands too, and the Marshall Islands is the same kind of situation. You don't want to move there to establish yourself as a entrepreneur or as a, well, basically, yeah, to start anything. I wouldn't recommend it. And Japan is the same way. I think if you come to Japan, you have to have some objective in mind that goes much deeper than simply making money, because although the government will allow for foreigners to come in under those circumstances, I don't think that you'll succeed for more than a couple of years. I think the average is not high, for at least for Americans who come to teach English. And I don't know about other businesses. I've seen plenty of YouTubers who do other things besides English. And what I found to be the case was that if you work in Japanese society, you're going to be under the same pressures that Japanese people are under. But since you're not Japanese, you're not going to be able to comply completely, and then there will be some dissonance there. So the same goes if you're starting a business or doing any kind of business that doesn't completely agree with the way that things are here. Of course, now Japan is on the decline in terms of population. Economy is stable, politics are stable, political situation is stable, but when it comes to changes, people don't accept changes. Even in the larger metropolitan area, we live in the greater metropolitan area of Tokyo, and I would say that people don't generally accept new ideas. So if you're presenting any kind of new concept, don't expect a good reception. So I guess that's my point of this video. Be aware of that. If you're a tourist, if you've got the money and you can travel around, then I would say, good on you, right? Like that's a good thing. Go for it. I did the same thing when I came to Japan before we started living here. I came 3 times. I got the Japan rail pass, and I stayed in capsule hotels, and I went to Hokkaido, and I went all the way down to Hokkaido, to Hiroshima and everything, and it was good. But starting a business, you've got to be a little bit stubborn to the point of being samurai-ish, I would say. You've got to be consistent and stubborn and dogged and orthodox, I would say. So I'd say I can do it because I have that kind of mentality. I wonder if you do too. So if you can do it, then you probably have a Japanese spouse. I don't know that anybody can do this without, perhaps Asians can live here, Koreans and Chinese can sometimes live here, and especially if you have ancestry in Japan. But apart from that, the chances of succeeding here without that, doing a business that you find that is actually counter to the way that people think, chances are not good. So I thought I might present that to you as a anecdote, I guess. If you're thinking about living in Japan, if you're thinking about being an entrepreneur in Japan especially, I wouldn't recommend it unless you're willing to deal with the harshness of the counter thoughts that become prevalent when you start to do what isn't customary in Japan. and you will probably need a Japanese spouse. So anyway, that's my thoughts for this, and thanks for watching.